Welcome to your quadratic formula notes. Today our learning target is how can I solve quadratic equations by the quadratic formula. Solutions to a quadratic equation are your x-intercepts, so where we cross the x-axis. So we can have two solutions because our quadratic can cross the x-axis at 2 points. We can have one solution where our quadratic equation just touches at 1 point, and that would be when it's the vertex that only touches. So it could open up or it could open down like that. And then we also have no real solution. In this one, you'll learn more about this in high school. It's going to be an imaginary solution or imaginary numbers. And you will get to that in high school. But for this year, we just say no real solution. So it just never, ever touches that x-axis. So it could look like that, or it could look something like this. The quadratic formula is how we get the solutions to a quadratic equation algebraically. So this is how we get it graphically, by graphing it and finding those x-intercepts. When we don't want to graph it or just prefer an algebraic approach, we have the quadratic formula. So the solutions of a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. I'm going to stop right there because there are some important pieces here. On the left side of the equal sign, the quadratic is in standard form. So a is in front of x squared, b is in front of x, and c has no variable. On the right side, it equals 0. You have to have the equation equal 0 because if you think about standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals y, that 0 is replacing y. We're saying that y equals 0 because your solutions lie on the x-axis, and any coordinate point on the x-axis is when y equals 0. Because if you look on the x-axis, it's crossing y at the origin, which is when y is equal to 0. So that has to be the case. It has to equal 0. Then your quadratic formula is x equals, so we want to know what x is because it's our x-intercepts. We want to know that x-coordinate when y is 0. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So it is in fraction form where we have the numerator and the denominator. A cannot equal 0 because if a equals 0, then we don't have a quadratic equation. We just have a linear equation. And b squared minus 4ac must be greater than or equal to 0. Because that piece is underneath the square root, and we can't take the square root of a negative number. We try to do the square root of -4. Let's just show you that. Got the square root of -4. We press enter, and we get this error message that says non-real answers. So that's going to be another thing you'll touch on in high school. Because when that happens, that means you have no real solution. That means your graph is not touching the x-axis. All right. So I'm going to show you two different examples of how to solve a quadratic using the quadratic formula. One, we're going to go through it step by step. And then the other, we're going to just allow the calculator to do all the work for us. But before we do that, we do need to understand what we're typing into the calculator. So we're going to go through a step-by-step example. Solve the quadratic equation 2x squared minus 3x minus 5 equals 0. So first step is to make sure that the equation equals 0. Since this one equals 0, our first step is done. Now we need to identify our a, our b, and our c. So we have ax squared plus bx plus c. Our a is in front of the x squared, so it's 2. Our b is in front of the x, so make sure you take the sign with the number, and that's -3. Our c has no variable next to it, so it's -5. Now that we know our values for our variables, we get to plug them into our quadratic formula. So x equals, I'm going to draw the fraction bar first, the opposite of b. Now every time I run into a variable, I'm going to put parentheses and then put the number inside the parentheses. Otherwise, we're going to get some incorrect solutions. Plus or minus, that's just going to mean we're going to have to do this equation 2 times. Plus or minus is the math equivalent to give or take. So if you said I ran give or take a mile today, that means you ran pretty close to a mile, but you could have run like a little bit over a mile or a little bit under a mile. So that's plus or minus. So we're on either side of a certain number. Then we finish with the square root of b squared, so in parentheses b, and then squared outside the parentheses, minus 4 times a times c. And then on the bottom is just 2a, so 2 times 2. All right, now let's start simplifying this. So we'll start with the opposite of negative 3. The opposite of negative 3 is positive 3. We normally just see that as a double negative, but we can read that as the opposite of negative 3, which would be positive 3. Plus or minus, now we have this square root of all of this stuff underneath it. So let's simplify the underneath part first. We have negative 3 squared. Well, that's negative 3 times negative 3, which would be positive 9. So now we have the square root of 9 minus 4 times 2 times negative 5. Well, what is 4 times 2? 4 times 2 is 8. And then 8 times negative 5 is negative 40. So we can replace this piece with negative 40. This double negative here becomes a positive. The opposite of negative 40 is positive 40. 9 plus 40 is 49. So we can replace this piece underneath the square root with 49. And what is the square root of 49? The square root of 49 is 7. So right here we can put 7 because this whole piece was equal to the square root of 49, which is equal to 7. Then on the bottom we have 2 times 2. Well, 2 times 2 is 4. Now that we have all of those pieces simplified, we need to break this off into 2 pieces. We need a plus piece and a minus piece. So we have 3 plus 7 over 4. And then we have 3 minus 7 over 4. So it just breaks it into 2 different problems. 3 plus 7 is 10 over 4. 10 divided by 4 is 2.5. So that's one of our answers. And then 3 minus 7 is negative 4 over 4. So negative 4 divided by 4 is negative 1. That's our other answer. So we would write out our solution as x equals 2.5, comma, negative 1. The order of the numbers does not matter. So you could write it as x equals negative 1, comma, 2.5. Either answer would be acceptable. All right, so now let's go through the calculator example. We have 2k squared plus 9k equals negative 7. We first need to check to see if this is equal to 0. It's not equal to 0, so we need to manipulate our equation to make this equal 0. Negative 7 to become 0, we would just need to add 7. We add 7 to the right, we need to add 7 to the left. So we get the equation 2k squared plus 9k plus 7. Now that it's equal to 0, we can identify our A, our B, and our C. A equals 2. B equals 9, and C equals 7. Plug those into our quadratic formula, which is x equals the opposite of b. Now remember, every time we're plugging these numbers in with parentheses, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now that we've replaced our variables with their corresponding number, we get to use our calculator to type this in. We're going to have to type this in twice though because of that plus or minus. So we're going to have one time where we type it in using the plus sign and one time where we type it in using the minus sign, and that'll give us our two solutions. So first thing we're going to do is get our fraction bar so that we have that fraction. So alpha button, y equals, enter, -9 plus, I'm going to start with the plus, square root is the second button, and then x squared. We have 9 squared minus 4ac all over 2 times 2. Make sure it matches your equation that you have written out. Press enter, and we get -1. So one of our answers is -1. X equals -1, comma. Now we just need the one with minus, so subtracting. So we have -9. Oh, excuse me. First, we need to get that fraction bar. We have -9 minus square root of 9 squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Make sure it matches. Press enter, and we get -7 over 2. Or if you'd like, that's really -7 divided by 2, which is -3.5. So you can write it as a fraction or as a decimal. Either answer option is acceptable. So -3.5. All right, that's all the notes I have for you today. Thank you for watching this video, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel.